43 years ago, the United States began basing its armed forces entirely on volunteers. Today, only 0.5% of Americans serve in our armed forces, and only about 1 in 6 Americans has served in the armed forces or has a family member who has served in the armed forces since 9/11. 1 in 6 Americans with direct experience of the armed forces since 9/11, a generation ago. Are Americans losing touch with the people who defend them? With us today, someone who can answer that question in detail, Kori Schake. Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Kori Schake did her undergraduate work at Stanford, where her professors included Condoleezza Rice, then obtained her doctorate in government at the University of Maryland. Dr. Schake has worked, and get ready for this, Dr. Schake has worked at the Pentagon, the White House, and the State Department. She has taught at West Point, Johns Hopkins, the University of Maryland, and the National Defense University. Now a fellow at the Hoover Institution, Dr. Schake has just published a new book, Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military. Her co-author and co-editor, retired General James Mattis of the United States Marine Corps. Kori Schake, welcome.
It's a great pleasure.
First things first, Warriors and Citizens is based on polling data. You worked with YouGov, polling firm, to ask large numbers of Americans a number of questions about the military. And I'm quoting you in the introduction to Warriors and Citizens, quote, "We initiated this project out of curiosity about whether after 40 years of an all-volunteer force, the American public was losing its connection to the military," close quote. Jim Mattis, your co-author, 4 stars in the Marine Corps. You've worked in and around the United States military your entire professional career. What was worrying you?
Well, the last big systematic data collection about what Americans think about their military was done in 1998. And so we were intensely curious whether 15 years at war with a military force, our all-volunteer force was never designed to sustain continuous combat without calling up reserves and engaging the nation in a more thorough way than we have in the wars that we've been fighting. So Jim and I were curious to see whether that the extended combat deployments of our military forces were actually changing how the public viewed them. Were they drifting apart? You very often hear military people say that we're not a country at war, we're just a military at war.
Right.
And so we wanted to plumb the depths of what Americans think about their military.
And was there also, the Vietnam War became unpopular, and as vets began returning from Vietnam, some of that unpopularity attached to them. We know that the conflict in Iraq became unpopular, so I suppose it's a reasonable question to ask whether Americans were beginning to look down on the people who were fighting those unpopular wars. Okay, so briefly speaking, reassuring? What was the finding?
It was actually reassuring. What was not reassuring was how little Americans know about our military. Like, most people couldn't come within a factor of 6 on the size of the Army or the Marine Corps. But the heartening thing was that although they don't know much, Americans' judgment is actually really good on issues of the use of force. That was a really pleasant surprise for us.
Now, what do you mean by that? Their judgment on the use of force, whether they approve of this or that engagement?
No, what we were looking at more is that if you look at the American model of civil-military relations, our military has a very broad role in the shaping of policy, but ultimately they are advisors. It's the president's responsibility to hear, to seek, and hear out their advice, but only elected officials in the American system are responsible for aggregating our social preferences on what wars to fight, how much blood and treasure and national commitment to put into them. And a public that doesn't know much about its military understands that. They hold the elected officials properly responsible for whether we're winning our wars.
Got it. So this question of ignorance, I have to say, this is a little shocking. I'm on page 290 here of Warriors and Citizens. Question. Do you agree or disagree? Most members of the military have a great deal of respect for civilian society. Don't know? 45%. Military force should be only used in pursuit of the goal of total victory. Don't know? 42%. When force is used, military rather than political goals should determine the application. Don't know? 40%.
Right.
Huge degrees of I don't know, which is what? There would be a difference between sheer ignorance, I know too little about the way our system works to form a judgment. That would be one thing. And on the other, you might read into this is kind of deference. I don't know, meaning I'll leave it to the generals and the civilians to sort out.
Yeah.
What do you make of it?
I think you're exactly right. It is not just a lack of knowledge, but the American military has such a special and reverential place in American society. It is by far the most trusted institution in American public life. Something like 6 times as popular as the Congress among the American people. And so there is, and a third thing I would add, actually, that I think weighs in on public attitudes is that there was so much attention to post-traumatic stress, and there is a tendency on the part of the media to treat our military as though everyone is damaged by their military service, rather than, as you talked with Jim about some time ago on Uncommon Knowledge, about post-traumatic strengthening, that for the vast majority of folks who serve in the American military, it is an experience that makes them better business people, better husbands, better fathers and mothers. And that doesn't get captured very often in public discussions about the media. Okay. And so there's a tendency almost towards victimization of the military.
Let me quote from Warriors and Citizens. Quote.
Sure.
The public believes that most veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress, even that they pose a danger to themselves and others. The public believes that. So that's not just ignorance, that's mistaken, right? Mm-hmm. This has been disproven. Only 15% of veterans experience PTSD. 43% of veterans now receive some disability rating. Suffering or witnessing violence is no longer required for the VA to categorize a veteran as suffering from PTSD, and claims once made are almost never downgraded over time. Disability payments to veterans have doubled, and the average payment has increased by 60% since 2000. So, we respect the military. Do we coddle them? What conclusions do you draw from this? That the tendency of the media to portray vets as victims has worked itself into policy. That's the way the VA, the Veterans Affairs Departments, treats them.
Yes, and very often members of Congress as well.
Right.
As we talk about in the book, the Veterans Administration coaches retiring service women and men to encourage them to maximize their potential disability in order to maximize the amount of assistance that they will receive.
Okay, and Kori Schake, I'm just trying to think now. So when people retire, if you go to your local Social Security office, they will quite rightly make sure that you're aware of all the benefits that are due to you. That's one thing. That's just the government making sure you're aware of what you're entitled to under law.
Right.
But if the Veterans Affairs Administration is now encouraging, saying, well, you don't look too good to me. Maybe you could find you had a little trouble with that elbow. You could find what's going on. Something you really disapprove. Something insidious is taking place or not?
I do think it's insidious, actually, because it diverts resources from veterans who actually are in genuine need. Right? Our national resources are not unlimited, and encouraging people to, for example, sleep apnea is not a condition that is in any way connected to people's military service.
Right.
And yet it is on this list.
And you also write in Warriors and Citizens this notion of diverting resources. Again, the enormous respect Americans have for our military is obvious in ways large and small, including the overwhelming support in Congress, you were just talking about this, for increasing military, not military spending, military pay and benefits, even when the military services themselves would like to curtail the rate of growth. So, as you write in the book, nobody in Congress gets elected by running against more money to people serving in uniform.
Right.
Even when the planning staff says, actually, we'd like another carrier over here, or we'd like another base over there, we'd like a little more material and equipment, our pay is just fine.
Right.
How serious is the problem?
It's actually quite serious. The all-volunteer force is becoming unaffordable because the Congress is unwilling to close bases. We have about 20% more military bases than the Pentagon wants to have. Congress won't close those. They won't permit any reduction in the rate of raises that are, so we're not even suggesting that military pay be reduced, but Secretary Gates and all of the service chiefs have argued for years on Capitol Hill that we need to slow the rate of increase of military salaries because with sequestration and with the defense spending reductions that President Obama has brought into force, that you are squeezing out money for essential training that keeps our soldiers alive and for the kind of equipment that's top-notch that we want them to have the battlefield dominance of us buying for them.
Got it. Okay, so the respect combined with a kind of vagueness about the military is something that members of Congress use. They get, right, this is a problem. Another segment here, liberals and conservatives, politics.
Yeah.
Two findings, if I may, that emerge from warriors and citizens. Finding number one, the military is more conservative than the public. It just plain is. I quote the book. By 1993, the officer corps had become less politically liberal and more conservative than in the late 1970s. In 1976, 16% of the officer corps identified themselves as either somewhat or very liberal. In 1993, 3%. No reason to suppose that's gone up since then. Meanwhile, the percentage of officers identifying themselves as conservative increased from 61 to 73%. Okay, that's finding number one. Finding number two, only one group of Americans consistently displayed in your polling negative or skeptical views of the military, and that is those who identify themselves as very liberal, which is about 5% of respondents. Okay. You've got the military becoming more politically conservative, item one. Item two, there is one group of Americans that just doesn't seem to like the military very much. And that's people who call themselves very liberal. And although it's only 5% of the population, it is a very influential 5%. We know that those people who call themselves very liberal are hugely overrepresented in the mainstream media, in universities,
right,
in positions of influence. They are opinion shapers and makers. And Kori Schake looks at this and says, trouble coming, or we can learn to live with it, or what?
Jim and I do think it's problematic. And it connects back to this point about the lack of public knowledge. Because that, you know, if very few Americans have much experience of military service, and they know very little about it. They don't have family members. They don't study it in college classes. That there is a tendency on the part of the public to believe that the laws, the norms, the social practices that are appropriate to our broad, beautiful, progressive American civilian society are also appropriate in the military. And the biggest concern that Jim Mattis and I had as we were sifting our way through this data and coming to our conclusions is that for a whole host of reasons, American political leaders are choosing to incorporate risk into our military by dint of the social and legal policies that they are bringing into our military. And those are eroding the battlefield lethality of our military. And we don't think that political leaders are acknowledging that. And again, very many of the policies that they advocate are good and worthy, but there is a trade-off in battlefield effectiveness that because we have been so long because we are so distant from memories of American prisoners of war on Bataan and Corregidor, or in North Korea during the Korean War, we have lost a perspective that even very good militaries can lose wars. And we are being somewhat reckless in the amount of risk we are asking our military to incorporate in order to make them more and more like our civil society.
Brass tacks here. Gay rights, don't ask, don't tell was
Women
workable,
in the
but now
infantry.
you've got women in combat. I'm trying to think what else would come to mind. You are now required throughout the United States Armed Services to accept and draw no distinction between openly practicing homosexuals and heterosexuals. Mm-hmm. So that's don't ask, don't tell was sort of workable. That's gone. Now ask, tell, and treat as you would anybody else. Right. And then you've got women in combat. There's still some hedging and still certain categories, I think, where women are not, in other words, it's not just totally carte blanche, but women are working their way into combat positions, correct?
So women already serve in combat in the American military. The question, the policy issue that the Obama administration has recently resolved is women serving in the infantry. In ground combat units. And 85% of the men currently serving in the infantry oppose that. And as Jim Mattis is fond of saying, when he was a commander, he would have relieved any lieutenant who overrode the attitudes of 85% of their NCOs and soldiers.
Okay, so let's draw a distinction here. You are not saying, you don't even want to enter the issue of women's rights. Your entire concern here is battlefield effectiveness. And if introducing women into combat, you are not saying, I have reservations about introducing women into combat because I have reservations about women in the workforce in America generally. You're saying I have reservations about introducing women into combat because there's pretty good evidence that it makes the combat less effective, more dangerous, puts people's lives at risk, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I'm trying to tease out your position here. Mm-hmm. Would you suppose that the 85% who oppose women in the infantry, the 85% of men who oppose women in the infantry are simply going to fade away, that attitudes will change? Is it purely a question of their attitudes? Or is there something, I mean, is there this note that on average women aren't as big, as strong, can't carry the same pack?
I think
is there a kind of permanent component, or is it purely a question of waiting for attitudes to shift?
I don't think it's just, I wish Jim were here to answer this question. I don't think it's just a transient...
He's in hiding. He'd much rather have you answer it.
I don't think it's a transient issue. You know, although I agree with you that political elected officials are treating it as though, you know, we just need to get these dinosaurs passed, and once people have experience with women in the infantry, attitudes will change. I'm less confident that that's true for the reasons that you raised. There are two sets of issues that have caused the 85% of men serving in the infantry to oppose this. One is concerns about physical strength and fitness, right? Can you actually carry a wounded fellow Marine out of danger? And there are some women who can meet those standards. And we're seeing some of them in the first women who come through the pipeline. Mm-hmm. They're extraordinary soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. But the second category of concerns is about unit cohesion and about whether when a sergeant determines that somebody needs to do something really dangerous, who do you choose to do it? And how do the rest of the people in the unit respond to that? Got it. Unit cohesion is hugely important in close-in fights. And in my judgment, a lot of the military's concern is more about unit cohesion. Because in a weird way, the discussion about women in the infantry actually more closely approximates the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was again about unit cohesion. Military folks just don't want to deal with the problem of sexual attraction and emotional commitment playing out on a battlefield.
Right. And so the notion then is that there are genuine concerns in the military that the politicians are disregarding,
Right.
because the American public isn't paying close enough attention.
Right, so they pay no political price.
Right.
And the risk we are incorporating into our military won't be revealed until we start losing wars.
Right.
But it is creeping in ways that the political elites aren't acknowledging, and that an uninformed public is not requiring them to pay a price for.
Okay. Civilian control of the military. A couple of quotations now from Warriors and Citizens. One is, I'm quoting McCubbin Owens, who's one of your contributors here. As fewer and fewer Americans serve in the military, the mutual trust that is necessary for healthy civil-military relations may well erode, raising the specter of Praetorianism, of the sort that haunted France in the 50s and 60s as a result of the French military's experiences in Indochina and Algeria. In other words, the notion, particularly among the officer class, that only they see the reality that the nation faces. Only they see the dangers clearly. The politicians refuse to see them. The people are ignorant. They see what no one else sees, and that places on them a certain duty. They really do become disengaged, detached from the political and cultural structures of the country. Quotation 2. In your concluding chapter, you and Jim quote a short story by Phil Clay.
Oh, it's so good.
A young vet. That kid can write, too. So here, let me give you this quotation. It's a little bit long, but it makes your point beautifully. The weird thing with being a veteran, at least for me, this is from Phil Clay's short story, is that you do feel better than most people. You risk your life for something bigger than yourself. How many people can say that?
Yeah.
You chose to serve. Maybe you didn't understand American foreign policy or why we were at war, but it doesn't matter. You held up your hand and said, I'm willing to die for those worthless civilians. Close quote. Okay, you found in Warriors and Citizens that Americans respect the military. Do you see signs that the military does not respect civilians?
So we did not poll military attitudes, but the veterans in our civilian survey were our proxy for them. And no, actually, we did not find that. One of the things, academics who are interested in civil-military relations are always get excited by the 7 days in May scenario, right? That you have a military who's so disrespectful of the elected civilian leadership that they seize power themselves. That's not a realistic scenario. In fact, the American public is actually quite encouraging of the military taking a much more active role. The American public, for example, it comes through in the polling we did for this book, is perfectly comfortable with retired military folks doing what they have been doing this election cycle, giving speeches at partisan rallies and things
Endorsing
like
Trump,
that.
endorsing Clinton.
Right. The people who oppose that are the American military themselves. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joe Dunford, the last chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey, both of them are on record saying this is actually really bad for the military. And not because it will stoke concerns of a military takeover of elected governance in the United States, but because it will fan the concerns of our elected political leaders that our military is partisan.
Right.
And they will therefore either hesitate to promote into senior military positions people who they feel are not of their political persuasion,
Right.
or they will view the military advice they get as partisan rather than as trying to paint them into a corner, or as President Obama's White House staff accused the American military of during the Afghanistan policy reviews at the start of his administration, of trying to box the president in by their military advice.
Well, all right, so let me flip the question then. You say there's no sign that the military in this country is going to become like the military in France. There's no sign, nobody's going to stage a coup. The military isn't going to start disobeying orders. That's fine. So let's flip it. McCubbin Owen's essay again. Now he notes that the military clashed with the Clinton administration over operations in the Balkans, that a lot of high-ranking officers opposed President Bush's surge in Iraq, and that he says most military officers, that's his phrase, I thought that was very striking, most military officers opposed President Obama's withdrawals from Afghanistan and Iraq. 1, 2, 3, where the military didn't like it, but did it anyway. They followed the executive branch's orders anyway. Hold that thought. We also know that your friend, General H.R. McMaster, wrote a book when he was a colonel, I believe, called Dereliction of Duty. This is a very influential book. People in your line of work all know this book, and he argues that one of the failures in Vietnam didn't take place in Vietnam, it took place in Washington, and that the officers did not talk back enough to the civilians. They were not frank enough with the civilians. They didn't give it to Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara with the bark off. They offered rather dispassionate reports and then said, yes, sir, when they got the wrong orders. So the question, of course, is, does the military push back enough against civilians? The public would be happy to see them do so. H.R. McMaster thinks they need to do so or needed to do so more in Vietnam. Do they push enough?
So I would break the question down into two parts. The first is, is in the policy making process. Right? Before the president decides.
Before orders are given.
Exactly.
All right.
And subsequently. And the American model of civil-military relations blessedly starts with George Washington, who created the distinction that is reverentially honored by the American military, which is that up until the president's made a decision, the military has a responsibility to give their unvarnished advice on their area of competence. And the president has a responsibility to hear them out, but has no responsibility to take their advice. You know, if you read Washington's letters to the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War, it's so painful with, you know, him pleading for them to extend militia terms of service, for more food, for more weapons. And the Congress did as the Congress did.
Right.
And that ethos is so fundamental to the American military's view of itself that it's incredibly sturdy, both that they have to give their unvarnished advice and that it's none of their business whether the president takes it. So my read of McMaster's book is that he's arguing that in the policy-making councils that the military pulled their punches and therefore served their constituents, those young American men at that time who were in harm's way fighting the country's war. McMaster argues the military leadership served them badly. I don't think there's any doubt that the current crop of the American military leadership gives their unvarnished military advice in private. But the second piece of the question that you pose, which is what happens once the president does make a decision? And again, in the American model, it's quite clear, and you may recall Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Clinton administration, when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was being mooted. A young officer asked Colin Powell in public, you know, we disagree with this policy, what do we do? And Powell was quite clear in laying down the law, which is once the president has made a decision, you either salute and carry out his policy or you resign your commission. And I don't think there is
that remains absolutely basic.
Yeah, that is so, both sides of that line are so fundamental to how the American military sees itself. But the point you raise is the right one. What has shifted is not how the American military views itself, it's how the public views the military. And because public confidence in our elected officials has been plummeting, but respect for the military remains so high, there is public pressure for the military to speak out against policies they don't agree with, to take a much more active role in in shaping public perceptions of policies. And that's something that's currently being very hotly debated in military classrooms at Fort Leavenworth and Quantico and other places in order to reinforce the military's norm of its own behavior.
I see.
Because as the polling for this book makes clear, our military's sense of its own professionalism is the only restraint in that environment.
Right. So let me take this one question of civilian control and turn it just one more time, a third and final time. And let me ask you to conduct a very brief seminar here for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, one of whom is going to be the next chief executive, on how to handle the military. And again, in McCubbin Owen's article in your book, Warriors and Citizens, I beg your pardon, Thomas Donnelly's article, he refers to, this gets a little complicated, but you'll get the point, obviously, Elliot Cohen's book, Supreme Command, in which he studies the way various civilian leaders operated with their military. And Lincoln, Churchill, David Ben-Gurion, Donnelly writes, none was willing to grant much autonomy to his military men, and indeed much of their greatness, Lincoln, Churchill, and so forth, came from their willingness to introduce themselves into the sphere of military affairs. Now let me give you two models and ask you to comment on them for the benefit of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Donnelly notes that during the planning of the Iraq invasion, Donald Rumsfeld, civilian leader, Secretary of Defense, was all over the military. Tommy Franks was in charge of planning, and Rumsfeld said, you've got too many. He had them cut their forces by 2/3. Every day, almost every hour, he was on the phone, look at this memo, and he was making specific suggestions, change this, change that. On the other hand, you've got Ronald Reagan, a story told to me by Ed Meese, who was president at the time, when the Libyans were causing us some trouble in the early Reagan years. Some generals came over to the Oval Office and briefed the president on the matter and asked about rules of engagement. And in fact, Ed said that they brought with them a map of the Mediterranean and Libyan airspace that was a little too big for the desk, so they unrolled it on the floor of the Oval Office and said, Mr. President, if our fighters are fired on by Libyan jets, do we have your permission to pursue them out of international airspace into Libyan airspace? And Ronald Reagan replied, you have my permission to follow them back into their hangars.
It's a great story.
So on the one hand, Don Rumsfeld, you ride that military, you ride your officers hard, hour by hour, minute by minute, make written suggestions, read the materials, force them to change their plans. And on the other hand, Ronald Reagan, you just give them your support. What's the fundamental attitude that Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump should adopt?
So very often people who look at military strategy would like to leach the politics out of it, like to pretend that, strategies are a rarefied art. But in fact, the best military strategies are politically integral, right? It has to be connected. The president has to choose the political objectives. And then the military, then the cabinet comes up with strategies, political, economic, military means to achieve the president's objectives. And only the third order of that is the military coming up with military means to feed into the strategy process. So we very often treat military strategy as though it's the entirety of the undertaking. The most important thing a president can do is set clear, achievable political objectives and communicate that clearly to the cabinet so that everybody else can do their subordinate piece of coming up with Treasury Department actions and State Department actions. And for the military itself, my objection to your description of Secretary Rumsfeld doing his job is that the military is really good at figuring out the number of port handlers they need to get shipped. You don't need to supervise that. The American military is unquestionably professional about the undertaking. What Secretary Rumsfeld did not do particularly well, in my judgment, was take the president's political objectives, regime change and prevention of weapons of mass destruction use, and translate that into military objectives that could be planned against. Namely, what Secretary Rumsfeld
So
was
he
doing.
was monkeying around with logistics. That's their business.
Yeah,
Is that what you mean?
he wasn't doing what only the Secretary of Defense can do, which is say, does this military plan achieve the president's political objectives? Is a fast dash for Baghdad the best way to ensure a regime change that stabilizes Iraq and fosters democracy? That's the Secretary of Defense's job. And in my judgment, Secretary Rumsfeld did too much tactical supervision, too much operational supervision, and not enough marrying of the president's political objectives into the strategy.
I see. Whereas by contrast, although Ronald Reagan seems almost to have deferred, almost deferred in a way that was casual, in fact, the political objective, we push back against the Libyans in a way that the previous administration did not. That was totally clear.
He was clear
You have my
about the
support.
commander's
Go get them.
intent.
Got it. Okay.
And that's essential.
Okay.
Because the whole system gets bogged down and if that doesn't occur. And I would suggest in the wars we are currently fighting, that is the standard President Obama has failed. That he has not made clear what our political objectives are and how military force fits into the achievement of those objectives. He seems to think that you can give a commander's intent, you can give political objectives that are gas pedal and clutch working in elegance together. And military force is a blunt instrument. And President Obama, I think, doesn't understand that and doesn't believe it can achieve things.
Okay, so that's what would, if you had been president, and by the way, you would have had my vote.
Thank you for your support.
If you had been president in the last 4 or 5 years, what would you have said was our objective in Afghanistan? I mean, on the one hand, you've got the Obama administration saying, we're getting our troops out of there as fast as we can, but at the same time, we're keeping surveillance satellites up and we're popping people with drones when we need, we're killing people. We have some military objective, but we want the troops. What would you have said?
Yeah. So the problem with President Obama's strategy in Afghanistan is that he has complex political military aims that fundamentally require a competent, well-functioning Afghan political system.
I see.
And yet he has invested very little in producing that political system, right? So we don't have a strategy for Afghanistan. We just have a military strategy. The diplomatic and economic and other pieces that would be required, and they are enormous and of long duration if you want to achieve the kind of sophisticated political military goals that President Obama is advocating for Afghanistan. So you could do one of two things.
Right,
you can either simplify your objectives to something military force can achieve, which
would be
destruction of the Taliban.
Okay.
That's an achievable military objective. And then leave the problem elsewhere. And the resources President Obama has put towards the Afghanistan war are roughly equivalent to doing that, but they are wholly inadequate to achieving a stable, self-sustaining, progressive Afghan society.
And that's your second choice is if you say
ramp way up your resources if you think you are going to achieve those objectives.
If you say we are going to get out of there and leave the problem to the Afghan nation, you have to build an Afghan nation because none exists.
Right.
Roughly. Okay. Last couple of questions. One final quotation from Warriors and Citizens. Quote, because the American public holds its military in such high regard, and we, the American people, are putting it at greater risk. We have allowed our strategic thinking to atrophy, allowed our policy making to become flabby because our military's high level of performance has lulled our sensibilities. Close quote.
Yeah.
What do you want to do about that?
So we think that actually, most people who study civil-military relations and who worry about gaps between civilians and the military, they have a whole bunch of advice about how the military can close those gaps. We think that releases from responsibility American civilians, both elected political leaders and all of us who are citizens, that we have a responsibility. We have many responsibilities in this gap. The closing the ignorance gap would be first and foremost, right? We have never lived in a time of greater or more easily accessible information. Americans have a responsibility to become familiar with the military that is shouldering the burden of protecting our vibrant society. That would be the first. The second, we have a whole host of suggestions for our elected political leaders about encouraging the military to give them unvarnished political advice, and also to understand they don't have to take that advice, that they should encourage a trusting relationship with their military leadership. They ought to actually model the kind of relationship that is healthiest in a free society, which is neither putting our military on pedestals, making them comic book heroes, nor treating them as victims, but understanding that they are our fellow citizens, and treating them with the normal, get your arms around your neighbor's goodness that has exemplified American society for such a long time.
Last question. You're a graduate of Stanford University. You did your undergraduate work here. This university, like a lot of fancy colleges and universities across the country, sends a lot more students, graduating students, every year into the Peace Corps and Teach for America than it does into the United States military. And the question for you is this. Somewhere listening to this, let's suppose there's a 19-year-old Kori Schake who's an undergraduate at Stanford, or why did you do what you did? Why is the study of the United States military, or why did Jim Mattis do what he did? You know lots of people who serve in the military. Why is service in the military, studying those in uniform or putting on a uniform yourself, a worthy way to spend your life?
Because it is ennobling to care about something bigger than yourself. It's nurturing the nobility of your own spirit. That's the reason to volunteer for military service in the United States. One thing I would say about Stanford is that you're right that most posh American colleges don't teach much military history. They don't. And yet Stanford encouraged me to teach a class here called Thinking About War, to try and draw students, to try and close that gap of knowledge and understanding, and to encourage students to take an interest in military service or in the study of military issues.
And my guess would be that the course is oversubscribed. My guess would be that kids love it. Is that right? There's an interest there?
I'm very pleased to say that students are interested in it.
Excellent. Kori Schake, co-author of Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military. Thank you.
Thank you.
For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson.